This is not a cabinet. This is a story. And if you give me a few minutes, I'll do my best to tell it. So here's the thing. I could try to tell this story in any number of ways. And I think they all have their merits. But this piece is deeply personal to me. And so this video is going to be a little bit different from my normal videos because I was very engrossed in being present with the build as I was working through some things in my own personal life. So I didn't talk to camera. I didn't think about what the video was going to look like. I didn't think about how it was going to play out. It was just hit record and focus on the object because the object was what I needed to make in the moment. It was a weird year. Guys, it's been a weird year. It's been a weird year for everybody, but in my personal life, we'll say it's been a little unstable. It's been an adventure. And the making of this cabinet was an attempt to create space to sit with all of that topsy-turviness and just do what I think I do best, what I'm most comfortable with, which is make things out of wood. So I took this slab that I've had for a little over 2 years, maybe 2.5 years, and started slicing up veneers because I had this idea in my head that I wanted to make this cabinet to hold some of these deeply personal objects. And I knew I was going to make it out of this slab. As soon as the idea popped into my head, I knew that this slab was the vehicle for that. And when I looked at the slab, it didn't quite have enough straight grain material. It didn't have enough stable material. There were a lot of checks in that slab. And so I decided that what I needed to do was veneer it. And I started cutting it up and started slicing veneers and sliced veneers for a few days because my bandsaw is drastically underpowered. And I mean, acres of veneers I cut, guys. But if you're going to do a thing that has this kind of emotional weight, I think that's a worthwhile pursuit. Now, I do want to come back to the conversation on veneering, why I chose to veneer it, and why I think that was really, really important to the composition of this cabinet as a whole, to the idea, and why straight grain, I think, plays into that concept outside of my mild OCD about straight grain. But before I do that, I do want to acknowledge the joinery that I'm using, the L10, and I'm not going to do a deep dive into it in this video because I've already made a video about that. Feel free to go check that out if you want to learn how to make it. But effectively, what this is, very briefly, is stack laminated plywood that's cut at 90 degrees. And what it does is it allows me to assemble the joint straight on rather than using a traditional domino and it being at 45 degrees. It just makes assembly a little easier. It's a little bit stronger, and it's a thing that you should play with if you are interested in creating structural miters. That said, back to the veneering question. So in order to explain why I think straight grain was so paramount to this vision that I had of this cabinet, I have to go all the way back to the pandemic, when one of my closest friends on the planet, Jenny Bauer, sent me a lock. Now, you may or may not know Jenny. She is the person who engraved my 102, my bronze block plane. She's an incredibly talented artist, illustrator, engraver, all of the things. And when we became friends, she sent me this lock that she engraved just for fun, just because. It's this old, probably 18th century padlock with a skeleton key. It's a delightful little object. But she sent it to me and said, when the time comes, you'll figure out something to do with it. And I've had it for the last 5+ years, just kind of waiting for the right idea to come to me, because it's so beautiful, guys. She's so talented at what she does that I didn't want to do a disservice to this piece. And Jenny's become one of my closest friends on the planet since. And when I approached her about this idea, I said, I want to make this cabinet that's kind of a reflection on the end of my last relationship. And she said, yeah, like, I dig it. That's whatever you choose to do with it, I trust you. And that being the case, I really thought that this lock needed to exist in the center of the cabinet. It needed to be the central focus of the cabinet, especially on the exterior. There's nothing else that's really going to draw the eye. I didn't want anything to draw the eye away from the lock. And so that's really why I needed the grain to be dead straight. It needed to be as subtle and as quiet as possible. It needed to clearly be intentional. It needed to be on a level of craftsmanship with Jenny's work, but it couldn't detract from Jenny's work. And that was the balance that I had to hit. So in order to achieve that, I had to chop the slab up, and I had to cut all of these veneers, and I had to veneer over the poplar core. Now, I could have absolutely veneered over a stable core. I could have laminated MDF. I could have used 1/2-inch MDF. I could have done lumber core. There's any number of options for that, but veneering over poplar, still giving it some solid wood properties. It's going to expand and contract a little, but not in the interior of the cabinet in any way that's going to interfere with the rest of the goings on in there. It's only going to expand front to back like a standard solid wood cabinet. And so that's what I chose to do, because there's no reason not to veneer over poplar. If you can account for wood movement, it's going to be just fine. So that all said, once the piece was veneered and the joinery was done, and I started cutting up the internals in the way that I've been doing for years, which is just lay a straight edge down and use a trim router and cut a dado and then shoulder them up on the table saw and fit them in. This is just basic woodworking at this point. It's just miters and dados and shoulders and sharp chisels, and starting to divide up the interior of this cabinet in a way that it would fit some of those specific objects I mentioned earlier. I knew how I was dividing this interior space up because I had all of these objects on hand that I wanted to put in there that needed a space to live for the time being. And each one of these components is sized for that. I mean, there are knickknacks, there are personal items. That vertical section on the right-hand side is sized for letters. So it's all very intentional. It's all based in proportional divisions, but done so in a way to fit specific objects. And because I was more working from an idea than I was from a plan or a drawing, it's really just cut, measure, make notes, make sure that I know where I went already and where I'm about to go next. And what's beyond that next step is something that will get determined once I get there. And that's just woodworking sometimes. So first of all, I just want to say, I know this video is already rambling. Probably doesn't even make all that much sense if I'm honest, because I'm really trying to hit this fine line between telling you guys the story of this cabinet and not feeling overexposed and telling you guys the story of this cabinet, if that makes sense. So, I mean, hell, we're already 13 plus minutes into this video. So if you're here, I imagine you're here to the end. So we ride. And now we get to kind of the crux of the design conundrum I was in. I talked a lot about the lock earlier and the straight grain and how those two things are going to play off of one another. But the door and the placement of this lock, I think, was equally as crucial. You can see this poplar mock-up that I had in order to figure out how to make the lock exist in the center of the door. And guys, this is not an exaggeration when I say I spent 2 weeks of full-time work, obsessive full-time work too. I'm not talking about 80 hours. I'm talking well over 100, trying to figure out how the hell I was going to place this lock in the center of the door. Because if the concept of this cabinet is me reflecting on the end of a relationship, really is what it is, if in full disclosure, in full honesty. But if that's what it is, and the lock is acting as a way for me to kind of put away the detritus, for lack of a better word, of this relationship, the objects that were linked to it, well, then the lock is kind of it's the soul of the cabinet. The cabinet is just a vehicle for the lock in that way. And if that lock was off to the side, like a gate latch, you wouldn't get that sense. And so it needed to live in the center. It could be in no other location. And so I mocked it up in poplar. And before I mocked it up in poplar, I mocked it up in foam, actually. So it started with an idea. It went to a foam mock-up. Then it became a poplar mock-up and an MDF mock-up. And then I started working in brass and seeing what I could do with the brass and drawing up the files and cutting it out on the origin is the only way I could possibly think to make this thing happen. So that was super helpful for that. But creating my own hardware, spring-loaded hardware embedded inside a door that's veneered, that's going to go away forever. Like there was no way to do this that I found where I could build the door and install the hardware after the fact. It had to be done simultaneously. So you can see this patch. This is the idea I came up with, which is effectively I routed the internal space for the mechanisms and then edge trimmed it and then veneered the outside face, routed through that face in order to create the relief for the latch and the stopper, and then created the patch on the backside using the origin again, same file, sandwiched it in the middle, and veneered over the back. And that is, guys, that's too much work. Don't make a cabinet like that. It was a terrible idea from a business perspective. But of course, this piece is not about business. This piece is not about making money. This piece was about, I don't know, getting the thing out, creating space to reflect. And figuring out what's next. We've all been there. Again, we're human. Like, we've all had those experiences, and they suck every time. So this was not even a labor of love. Like, it was a labor of necessity. And you can see how this mechanism works at this viewpoint, right? The handle pierces the door. The lower kind of latch prevents the latch from moving when the lock is in place in order to lock the cabinet. And then the whole mechanism is spring-loaded so that it naturally sits in its resting position. And visually, it all kind of makes sense whether the lock is there or not. So that was the adventure. Getting that to where it's at right now, I know that was like 3 minutes of video. Again, 2+ weeks of work. And I'm talking consultations with some of the best damn furniture makers I know as to how to make that work. Talking about learning how to mill brass. And big shout out to my buddy Sean, who does this all the time, and my shopmate Amanda, who they were immense helps in trying to figure out how to make that happen. And then having to create this plinth in order to veneer this thing. This is how ridiculous it is. I had to create this bed where the handle could be piercing the plinth, the bed, whatever you want to call it, so that when I go to veneer it, I can get adequate pressure on the backside, because of course I couldn't veneer the backside and then install. You see how far down the rabbit hole we have to go in order to make this concept work. And it is not in any way economically feasible. This is speculation work. This is furniture that you make because you have to make it, not because a client is paying you to make it, because no client would ever pay me to make this. This is a stupid idea. So in any case, the thing I was most concerned about in this particular process was whether or not I was going to damage the mechanism. And as you can see, all's well that ends well. So once that was done and complete and working, and I was elated after 2 weeks to know that had not all been a waste of time, then I realized I had an interesting problem, which is the cabinet is veneered, and the veneers are about 1/8 of an inch thick. I think they're actually about 3/32. And so where that latch pierces the cabinet is going to have exposed poplar. And I could not worry about it, but why get this far and then not worry about the details? So I ended up having to create this patch to fit in, which meant that I had to cut the hardware, the mortises for the offset knife hinges, so that I could place them in the cabinet, so that I could get the dimensions for the patch, because that's the only way I would know exactly where that latch fell, and then cut that and then glue the thing up and then hope that it all lines up the way that it was supposed to. And there's so many moving parts in this thing right now. And the miters, I had a little bit of trouble with the miters. I'm not going to lie, which is ironic because that's probably the least advanced component of this cabinet. But either way, once I got the cabinet glued up, the doors fixed up, everything was looking good, then I could cut the mortises for the door and really start to make some progress. Now, before we dive into talking about the internals and drawer making and all of those processes, I do just want to acknowledge the fact that I did pre-fin the cabinet and then glue it up. And the reason for that is, A, usually it's just easier to do that on a cabinet. But more importantly, there are so many tiny internal compartments, especially where these drawers exist, that it would have been physically impossible for me to finish it after everything was assembled. So I pre-finned all of the things and then glued up all of the things. And it was only then that I could start to make my drawers, because up until then I had a theoretical dimension, but who knows what those compartments actually were sized at. I mean, the smallest drawer on this cabinet is 2 by 2. So you kind of got to have the internals done and glued and stabilized before you can make those drawers. And at that point, I had a choice to make about the drawer fronts. And I really thought about making them out of walnut, but it didn't feel right. So I made 6 out of the 7 drawers out of English sycamore, which is, I mean, I've been relying on that trick for a while now. There's just something about that pairing that feels right to me, that brings me a lot of joy. So it has the right level of contrast, that kind of dark brown and that creamy white that go really well together. And I think it works for the composition. Now, as far as the drawer pulls go, this was my next decision I had to make. And once I had all of the drawers in there and was taking a look at how they functioned as a composition, I made the decision that I didn't want to disturb that aesthetic with drawer pulls. And there was another consideration, which is the fact that the smallest drawer had to be at a depth of 5.5 inches for what was going to go in there. And the drawer boxes are only 6 inches deep. So if I added a pull, even if it was only a 1/2 inch, by the time all of the components are in, it wouldn't have fit the things I designed it to fit. So the workaround that I came up with was to create a magnetic pull. And I only made one for all 7 drawers, and it works beautifully. But what that means is on the inside of the drawer front, I had to embed a rare earth magnet and then fill that with a plug, or I could have veneered over it if I so chose. And then I had to create a pull that worked with a rare earth magnet embedded in that. And so I turned one out of walnut and made sure that everything fit just right once the drawers were glued up. And then I could go ahead and pin my rabbets. And yes, I could have dovetailed them, but the truth is I kind of just wanted to get it done by this point. I was kind of emotionally exhausted by the time the drawers came around. And, I still think it works just fine for the piece. I don't know what to say, really. I mean, how do you end a video like this? Or I don't know how to end a video like this because, frankly, I already feel a little overexposed. Honesty is good, but it's a cabinet. It's the cabinet I felt I needed to make. And everything included. The veneering, the stupidity of that door, the making of these drawers and compartments to hold objects that are heavily weighted. I think all of that is or was necessary for what I needed at that moment in time. And I hope that you could take something from it that was helpful for you, because making it was helpful for me. Till next time, friends.